What we're witnessing in America today isn't ultimately a political crisis. It's spiritual. The violence erupting across our nation is a consequence of an ultimate struggle over the nature of truth, meaning, and human flourishing. This is a struggle between two incompatible worldviews, one that apprehends transcendent purpose, virtue, and divine truth as the origin of human flourishing, and another that reduces all of existence into material struggles for power. The assassination of Charlie Kirk, the plots against President Trump, and the wider cultural phenomenon of political violence that we are witnessing are all symptoms of this deeper spiritual battle. When cultures break free from transcendent truth and meaning, politics becomes a forlorn surrogate religion, and political opponents become not just opponents, but existential enemies who must be eliminated. Violence has no place in American politics, but in order to fully comprehend why it's happening, we must dig beneath the surfaces of political disagreement to the emptiness of spirit that's driving people to such drastic measures. Currently, we must unconditionally condemn these actions while striving to comprehend the worldview crisis below that's polarizing our nation. Recent acts of violence we must condemn. The killing of Charlie Kirk is the most recent and perhaps most symbolic move of this spiritual struggle masquerading as politics. Yesterday, September 10th, 2025, this 31-year-old conservative activist was killed by a bullet while speaking to students at Utah Valley University. A voice in American politics has been silenced by a bullet rather than argument or debate. This was not random violence. It was a calculated assassination of someone who dared challenge the entrenched orthodoxy in our schools. The plots against President Trump are not different. In July 2024, then-President Trump was assaulted and wounded at a rally, and one onlooker was murdered, 2 others severely injured. There was another assassination plot in September. Regardless of your political bent, plots to assassinate political leaders are plots against democracy itself. But more than that, they are the natural outcome of what occurs when political rhetoric becomes spiritual warfare. Even our children have not been exempt from this violence. Tragedy struck the Annunciation Catholic Church and School in Minneapolis on August 27, 2025, when 2 young children were assassinated and 21 others injured. Children who were literally praying were among the targets of the shooter, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey said. This attack on a house of worship and innocent children is a betrayal of the underlying spiritual roots of our crisis. The broader trend extends far beyond these front-page occurrences. From the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol to bombings directed at the residences of Supreme Court judges, from the Paul Pelosi assault to the gigantic increase in threats made against Congress members, from 3,939 instances in 2017 to 9,625 in 2021, we are witnessing record erasure of civil discourse. It is not simply political polarization. It is the breakdown of shared moral and spiritual touchstones. The philosophical sources of division, the stranglehold of critical theory on higher education. Charlie Kirk was not in Utah Valley University by chance. He was there precisely because American universities have become the hub of a revolutionary shift in how we think about society, truth, and human flourishing. Critical theory, with its intellectual roots in Marxist ideology, has dominated American universities over the last few decades. This approach is fundamentally opposed to the classical approach that Charlie Kirk promoted. As opposed to seeking truth through open debate and exchange of views, critical theory's lesson is that all relations are necessarily relations of oppression and relations of oppressor power. Existing institutions, values, and ways of thinking are seen as necessarily tainted systems of domination. The goal is not to find truth by dialogue, but to deconstruct and overthrow existing structures. Those who support the traditional values or refute these presuppositions aren't just wrong, they're complicit in regimes of oppression. This creates a culture where people like Charlie Kirk are not viewed as intellectual opponents to be argued with, but as operators of oppressive systems that need to be silenced no matter what. When you teach an entire generation that certain people aren't just wrong, but that they are bad, violence isn't just okay, it's also necessary from a moral standpoint. The erosion of traditional values and meaning. Whether religious or secular, it is not possible to avoid how thoroughly these ideas have undermined traditional sources of satisfaction and happiness that have been supporting human society for centuries. Traditional Christianity holds that happiness and fulfillment lie in living in accordance with moral virtues and principles, striving after relationship with God and higher purpose, finding meaning in love, service, and spiritual development, and understanding that material success and political power come second to spiritual fulfillment. Critical theory promotes a profoundly materialistic perspective that interprets all human existence into political battles for dominance, defines identity and worth in large part by group and victim status, teaches that happiness can only be achieved through political revolution and material redistributions, and dismisses higher sources of meaning as tools for oppression. Charlie Kirk was aware that colleges were no longer sanctuaries of education, but had become ideological fortresses. He dedicated his professional life to trying to return genuine intellectual diversity to campuses where conservative speakers are routinely shut down or disinvited. Students are indoctrinated into believing certain ideas are so threatening they cannot be spoken. Faculty members who critique critical theory dogmas are wrecked professionally, and the concept of objective truth is abjured as a tool of oppression. He believed that young people needed to be introduced to competing conceptions and make their own informed choices, a radical concept in our modern academic society. When you take away traditional sources of meaning, religion, family, community, virtue, transcendent purpose, and replace them with narrowly political and material ones, you're in effect making a spiritual vacuum. This vacuum is filled with rage and resentment toward those who insist on holding to old-fashioned values, a scorching quest for meaning through political activism and group identity, the necessity of finding enemies upon whom misery can be blamed, and an intolerance of any worldview that challenges this new orthodoxy. This goes a long way toward explaining why political differences now seem existential. When politics is your faith and material success is your sole indicator of having made it, those who disagree aren't merely wrong, they're withholding your salvation. Legal warfare, when courts become political weapons. The pattern of Trump legal cases that were withdrawn after he had been elected raises another element of this spiritual war, political weaponizing of our justice system. Special counsel Jack Smith announced on November 25, 2024, that he was dismissing his election subversion case and the classified documents case against President-elect Donald Trump. A federal appeals court has officially dismissed the remainder of that case against Trump valet Walt Nauta and property manager Carlos de Oliveira. Trump proclaimed total victory after the ruling, which spares him potentially a $500 million fine for decades of exaggerating his wealth when the giant civil fraud penalty was derailed by appeals court. Donald Trump is no longer under federal criminal indictment in the U.S. after being elected to a second four-year presidential term. The issue here is one of gravity. Were these prosecutions fair or political weapons designed to influence an election? The Trump prosecutions are not unique. We are seeing a broader pattern of what scholars call lawfare, the use of legal institutions as instruments of political warfare. The Justice Department has prosecuted in abundance more than 1,500 individuals who are affiliated with January 6, and at the same time, dropped nearly all charges against rioters affiliated with BLM. This discriminatory prosecution reflects the same spiritual dichotomy. Those with the traditional values must face the full brunt of the law, and those with revolutionary change are indulged. Worldwide, we see the same patterns. Latin American judges and prosecutors who are right-wing have consistently used tools and techniques provided by the U.S. to discredit, abstruse, and undemocratically oust progressive politicians throughout Latin America. Common to these examples of lawfare is dearth of due process and shaky evidence, unfounded accusations of corruption or abuse of authority, and round-the-clock airing of these allegations on television and the rest of the media. When courts themselves turn into battlegrounds instead of being dispensers of justice, trust in institutions is lost, and individuals start to realize violence as their last resort. The decline of intellectual tradition. Charlie Kirk, regardless of your feelings about his politics, stood for something essential to Western civilization. That truth comes through aggressive debate, as did the greatest minds of ancient Athens, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. He believed in the power of argument, evidence, and reason to persuade. This tradition of mental combat by words, not weapons, is the cornerstone of American democracy. Our founding fathers built a system based on the belief that competing ideas should engage in the marketplace of the mind, not the streets with violence. The heritage Charlie Kirk stood up for, based on classical philosophy and Judeo-Christian tradition, provides a radically different route. It instructs that there is such a thing as truth, and that it may be learned using reason, argument, and conversation. Human worth derives from being rational beings created in the image of God, and not from our identity groups. Bliss results from virtue, meaning, and transcendent purpose rather than material circumstances. Political adversaries are human beings with dignity due respect, not existential foes. If we look at the current climate, we see a divergence from this fundamental principle. Instead of hearing and debating out different points of view, we're increasingly seeing attempts to silence them through intimidation, violence, or legal warfare. The path forward. We stand at a juncture. We may go down the route of violence, coercion, and suppression of opposition, a route which leads to the breakdown of democratic principles. Or we can reaffirm those principles that made America great. All Americans are entitled to express freely their political views without violence or intimidation. We must return to regarding our political opponents as fellow Americans we simply disagree with, not as enemies to be destroyed. No political philosophy justifies violence against citizens, no matter how bitterly we may feel about what we are advocating. Our courts, schools, and civic institutions must remain fair referees, and not instruments of political warfare. But most of all, we must address the spiritual crisis at the root of this violence. We must rebirth higher sources of meaning and purpose that inspire people with hope beyond politics. We must remember again that human flourishing comes not from political power or wealth, but from virtue, community, faith, and service to a greater cause. The murder of Charlie Kirk is more than the loss of a single voice. It is a threat to the very notion that Americans can disagree without force. Every incident of political violence takes us further from the vision of a republic of citizens, self-governing through reason, argument, and the ballot box. We must denounce these acts not as partisans, but as Americans who believe in the power of ideas over violence, words over weapons, and of democracy over mob rule. But we must do more. We must address the spiritual vacuum driving people to such extreme behavior. The question at hand is simple. Shall we follow the example of Socrates and the founding fathers pursuing truth in dialogue? Or shall we allow violence to be the final resolver of political disagreements? Shall we find sources of purpose and meaning outside ourselves? Or shall we follow the path of materialist despair that sees politics as the only deliverer? It's our choice, but time is running out. The future of our republic depends not just on our political decisions, but on our spiritual renewal. Only by addressing the more fundamental crisis of meaning do we have any hope of restoring the civil discourse that democracy requires. Don't forget to subscribe and forward this message. Democracy depends upon citizens who will stand up and denounce violence in the pursuit of asserting a right to peaceful disagreement. But in the end, it depends upon citizens who understand that our ailments are spiritually as opposed to politically grounded.